Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her on the second day, not to her face but loud enough for the med room to hear. Sarah Chen was restocking the insulin vials, moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from having organized field medical supplies under fire, when his voice carried through the open door like something looking to cause damage. She didn't flinch. She didn't even pause. The vial went into its slot. The next one followed. Muscle memory. Discipline. The kind of composure that comes from 3 tours and a rank the hospital would never know about. The thing about carrying secrets is that they change how you move through the world. Sarah walked St. Michael's 3rd floor in Savannah with steps too economical for civilian nursing, each one placed like she was reading a tactical map. Her hands moved without hesitation during blood draws, for starts, patient transfers, the kind of precision that made the charge nurse trust her immediately and Dr. Pierce distrust her just as fast. He recognized something in her competence that he couldn't categorize, and men like him hated what they couldn't control. She'd been a decorated captain in the Navy for 12 years. 3 tours in Baghdad. 2 Purple Hearts. Her nursing credential was 6 months old, a cover so seamless that even the hospital director believed it. But her real mission, monitoring the patient in room 304, was 3 years deep, classified at a level that would make her civilian colleagues pale if they understood. Nobody here knew that the quiet night shift nurse who brought extra blankets to the ICU patients and never raised her voice during crisis was actually running operational surveillance on a Navy SEAL whose traumatic brain injury had erased memories she couldn't afford to see recovered. She kept her hair cut short, regulation length out of habit. Wore compression sleeves under her scrubs because the scarring on her forearms from shrapnel and rope burns, from carrying wounded men through city streets while rounds snapped overhead, never quite sat right in fluorescent lighting. She watched the hallway cameras with tactical awareness, noting blind spots and response times. And she never corrected doctors in front of patients. Until the insulin order. The med room at St. Michael's smelled like a combination of antiseptic and the humid Savannah night air that leaked in through the climate control vents. Fluorescent lights buzzed their familiar hum. Sarah had been checking the evening medications against the chart for diabetic patient in room 212 when she saw the error. Dr. Pierce had written an order for 20 units of Lantus for a 72-year-old woman with a documented history of hypoglycemia episodes. The dose would drop her blood sugar into dangerous territory. Not lethal, but dangerous. The kind of mistake that happens when a physician is tired or arrogant or both. She pulled up his chart notes on the computer. Verified the order. Verified the patient history. Then she walked to the med room window where Dr. Pierce was standing, reviewing his own notes, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone screen. His Oxford ring, the kind that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, caught the fluorescent light as he scrolled. Dr. Pierce. Her voice came out level. Deferential. A night shift nurse approaching a senior physician. The Lantus order for 212. The patient's documented baseline shows nocturnal lows at 68. 20 units will push her into hypoglycemic territory. He didn't look up from his phone. I'm aware of the patient's history. The prior insulin dose was 12 units. Documentation shows that resulted in a 2 a.m. glucose check at 82. 20 units is double her baseline. Now he looked up. His eyes were the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic, and they contained the kind of calculation that comes from someone who has never been questioned about medical decisions. He was 46. Trained at Johns Hopkins. His father had been a surgeon. His mother sat on the hospital board. He was the kind of physician who believed competence was hereditary. Are you suggesting I've made an error? The way he said it suggested she'd suggested he'd kicked a dog. I'm suggesting we verify the order. For patient safety. He set his phone down. Slowly. The kind of slow that carries threat like a tank idling in a garage. I write the orders here. You follow them. That's the arrangement. That's the entire arrangement, actually. Sarah held his eyes. No flinch. No step backward. Just acknowledgement. Yes, doctor. But she did something else. She pulled up the patient chart on the med room computer and called the pharmacy before she drew the insulin. The pharmacist, a man named Roland who'd worked at St. Michael's for 14 years, took one look at the order and the patient history and said, "Yeah, that's not right. I'll flag it and call Pierce." By the time Pierce got the call, the order was changed to 12 units, and Sarah had disappeared into room 304 to check on the patient who couldn't remember her name but whose forearm would tell a story she couldn't acknowledge. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm. Outside, the Savannah night was humid and dark, the kind of darkness that comes from being far from any military base, any helicopter pad, any of the infrastructure she'd lived inside for 12 years. She was civilian now. Undercover. And that meant watching a Navy SEAL struggle through rehabilitation without letting him see that she knew exactly what kind of trauma his brain was processing. James Morrison lay in bed 304 with his left arm exposed. The tattoo was impossible to miss. Phoenix, in block letters that looked fresh enough that the scarring was still visible. Her call sign. The name that had been broadcast over tactical radio for 3 years straight in the Jolan district of Fallujah while she moved wounded men through streets that smelled like diesel and blood and burning plastic. Morrison had been the third one she'd carried. 23 years old at the time. Right shoulder destroyed by fragmentation. Left leg compromised. She'd moved him 847 meters under sustained fire while his blood soaked through her gear and his breath came in panicked gasps, and she kept saying, "I've got you, Breaker. I've got you, stay with me," because his call sign was Breaker and the exfil point was a quarter-mile north and you don't drop operators on your watch. His traumatic brain injury had stolen the memory of her face. The doctor said the damage was localized to the temporal lobe, affecting episodic memory formation. He remembered his name. His rank. His mother's birthday. But the faces of the people who'd saved his life during the operation that damaged his brain in the first place, those were gone. Erased. Like the mission had decided to clean up after itself. Sarah checked his vitals without touching the tattoo. Pulse 94. Blood pressure elevated but not dangerously. The physical therapy had worn him out again. He'd been pushing himself, the physical therapist had noted, like his trying to prove something, which meant he still had some of the operator mentality left, the part that refused to accept limitations. Sarah understood that impulse perfectly. She'd been doing the same thing for 6 months. "How's the pain?" She kept her voice neutral. Professional. The voice of a night shift nurse, not a woman who had carried this man through Baghdad fire. "Fine." He didn't look at her. Eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Same as yesterday. The PT said you pushed hard today. Need to push." His jaw tightened. "They said I could be ready for active duty rotation next month if I meet the benchmarks. They said I just need to get the memory stuff sorted, and that's probably just time." Time, they said. Like time fixes everything. Sarah set down his chart. "Some things time does fix. They don't know what I'm missing." His eyes tracked toward the window, where the Savannah humidity pressed against the glass like something wanting in. "There's like a gap. Like I know there's something there that's supposed to matter, and it's just gone. Someone was there. During the operation. Someone important. I can almost remember the voice but not the face, and that's the part that's driving me insane. Like my brain's keeping score of something I can't access." Sarah's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. Memory has a way of finding its own timeline. "You talk like you know something about trauma," he said. Not unkind. Just observant. The kind of observation that combat training instilled, the ability to catalogue details in humans the way ordinary people catalogue nothing at all. "I know that the mind protects itself." She tucked the blanket around his shoulders, the movement automatic and gentle. "When you're ready to remember, you will." That was the lie and the truth wrapped up together. The lie was that memory was something that could be trusted to surface naturally. The truth was that she needed him to remember on her timeline, not his, because her mission brief was to confirm that his memory of the operation was intact enough to hold classified details, and if his brain had genuinely corrupted the tactical information he'd been carrying, she needed to know that before the Pentagon sent someone else to finish the assessment. "Night, Lieutenant," she said, and left him there with the tattoo bearing her name and no face to attach it to. The third-floor hallway stretched empty. The night shift at St. Michael's was the kind of quiet that comes from patients sleeping and most families gone home and the day staff dissolved into memory. Sarah passed the nurses' station where two RNs were charting, neither of them looking up, because she still hadn't figured out how to be the kind of colleague they wanted her to be. The kind who laughed in the break room and didn't spend her lunch breaks reviewing security footage on her personal phone and didn't move through hospital corridors like she was reading a tactical map. She was walking back toward the med room when Dr. Pierce's voice stopped her. Not loud. Just that particular timbre of authority that comes from never having to raise his voice because people had been taught to listen. "Your initiative with the insulin order." He was standing near the medication dispensing station, his arms crossed. The Oxford ring caught the light again. "That behavior doesn't happen here. You understand? I make the clinical decisions. You execute them. You don't second-guess. You don't verify. You don't make phone calls to pharmacy. You follow orders. That's your job. Not thinking. Not correcting. Following." Sarah's jaw tightened. But her voice came out level and deferential. "I understand, Doctor. I was concerned about patient safety. You were insubordinate." He stepped closer. "Not threatening exactly. Just territorial. I've got my eye on you now. Understand? I know what overconfident nurses look like. They're usually working in a capacity beyond their actual qualifications. So I'm going to be watching. And if you step out of line one more time, if you correct another order, question another decision, make another phone call, I'm documenting it. I'm building a file. And I'm making sure the hospital board knows that we hired someone whose credentials might not actually stand up to scrutiny." The threat was wrapped up in that last sentence like a gift. Sarah understood exactly what he was saying. "I can destroy you if I want to. I have institutional power. And you are visible to me now." She held his eyes. Didn't blink. Didn't flinch. The tremor wasn't fear. The tremor was restraint at the physical effort of keeping 12 years of military training locked behind the posture of a night shift nurse. "Understood, Doctor." He nodded, satisfied. Walked away. And Sarah stood in the med room with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of antiseptic in her lungs and the knowledge that the next 72 hours were going to go down in ways that neither of them anticipated. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce had just made himself visible too. And in the military, visibility was the first step to becoming a liability. The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's cast everything in a clinical white that left no room for shadows. Sarah moved through the hallway with the economy of motion that came from years of carrying wounded through Baghdad streets, her scrubs moving like water around muscle memory, and no one at this hospital would ever know that the woman refilling for bags had once carried a man who still couldn't remember her name. The MacGuffin detail, folded into the bottom of her locker, beneath her spare stethoscope and the regulation shoes she never wore, sat a flag. Not a large one, a 3 by 5 inch fabric, folded into the tight triangle they teach you in the military, holding the weight of a man who had died 6,000 miles away while Sarah held his hand. She touched it sometimes during breaks, just her fingertips against the nylon, and then she'd lock it away again and return to the pretense of being nobody. James Morrison lay in room 304 with his mother beside him and his sister standing near the window, and Sarah had spent 2 weeks building rapport with them, learning that his mother's name was Patricia, that his sister Elena worked in accounting, that they brought him magazines he couldn't quite focus on but appreciated because someone was trying. The pain management conversation began innocuously enough. Patricia had mentioned that James seemed uncomfortable in the afternoons, that he was grimacing when the physical therapists worked with his left leg, that the current medication schedule wasn't matching his actual pain patterns. Sarah, drawing on years of field medicine where timing pain relief meant the difference between a patient sleeping or deteriorating, suggested a modest adjustment to the phantom limb protocol, a slight increase in the gabapentin dose during the hours when his prosthetics training occurred, delivered in the morning instead of evening distribution. Dr. Pierce entered mid-sentence. He moved through the doorway like a man accustomed to displacement of air, his white coat catching the overhead light like a flag itself, and his eyes found Sarah speaking medical probability to a family member. Not asking for permission. Not deferring. Just stating clinical fact with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this before, somewhere else, with higher stakes. Nurse Chen, he said, his voice the texture of polished mahogany wrapped around broken glass, a word. She excused herself with a nod to Patricia, movement smooth, but Dr. Pierce didn't wait for the hallway. He said it right there, loud enough for the family to hear every syllable, loud enough that a nurse passing with a crash cart turned to look. We don't need the night janitor playing nurse to second-guess pain protocols. His jaw worked like he was grinding something between his teeth. Your job is vitals and bedpans. My job is medicine. Learn the difference. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent bed wheeze its mechanical rhythm. Sarah took one measured breath. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She was the kind of woman who had trained herself in a desert to remain still while mortars detonated close enough to move the sand, and this man's contempt registered exactly like wind register, something in the environment, not something that penetrated. A single tear escaped her left eye, formed by pure physics of facial pressure, and she wiped it without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice dropped to register, steady as a surgical laser. I've held dying men with more dignity than you'll ever possess. His face went cold. The expression shifted from anger into something calcified, something that looked like a man watching a wall he'd constructed begin to crack. He turned and left without response, which was worse than any words would have been, because silence meant he was thinking. Planning. Deciding how to ensure that no one at this hospital would ever listen to her again. The break room exile began that week. Sarah sat at the small table near the refrigerator during her dinner break, opening a container of rice and vegetables she'd prepared at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. Nurses filed in, Williams, Martinez, the day shift RN whose name she hadn't quite caught. They gathered their lunches, made brief eye contact, and left. One by one. Not angry. Just gone. As if proximity to her was contagious, as if her presence was something that would spread through the unit and contaminate whoever stood too close. The rumor started on social media, someone claiming her credentials came from an online source, that her references didn't check out, that she'd probably bought her license from some diploma mill. Sarah didn't respond to any of it. She ate alone. She worked alone. She returned to room 304 where Morrison had begun asking why she looked sad, and she lied and said she was just tired, because telling him the truth would require words she didn't have clearance to use. Then Dr. Pierce posted the write-up. It appeared on the unit board during shift change, printed on the hospital's official letterhead, laminated in clear plastic so it would be permanent. Everyone would see it. Sarah Chen, written warning for insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. The language was surgical. Nurse Chen demonstrated unsafe judgment by offering clinical recommendations outside her scope of practice to a patient's family members. This constitutes insubordination and a disregard for the established chain of medical authority. A verbal warning was issued on date. This written warning serves as documentation of continued policy violations. Further escalation may result in disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment. Sarah read it during shift change. 20 staff members stood nearby, pretending not to watch her read her own humiliation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone coughed. She lifted the pen that hung from a string beside the board and signed her name in the designated space, her signature steady and unwavering, and then she folded her hands and walked back to the medication room without changing her expression. Not shame. Not anger. Just the blank canvas of someone who had learned long ago that emotion was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. That night in room 304, Morrison was awake, watching the news on the small television mounted in the corner. He turned it down when she came in with his evening medications. "Why do you look sad?" he asked. His voice still carried the rasp of someone whose throat had been intubated multiple times. "Just tired," Sarah said, injecting the medication into his forepaw with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times. "Long shift. You're always tired." Morrison's eyes tracked her movements. Something flickered behind them, not quite recognition, but something like a frequency trying to align. "But you're good at what you do. Better than that doctor." She didn't respond. Didn't encourage conversation that might travel beyond this room. Instead, she checked his vitals, recorded them in the computer, and prepared to leave. Morrison grabbed her wrist as she turned. His hand was warm. His grip was stronger than his atrophied muscles should allow. "Phoenix," he whispered. Just that. Just her call sign, buried somewhere in the damaged architecture of his brain, clawing its way to the surface like something trying to escape. That means something. Sarah's hand tightened on the medication cart. She forced her shoulders to relax. Forced her breathing to remain even. "Sometimes morphine causes strange dreams," she said softly. "You should rest." She pulled away and left him there, knowing that Morrison was watching her go, knowing that some part of him was remembering, and knowing that if anyone discovered what was happening inside his broken mind, the entire operation would collapse. The Pentagon had given her a mission to protect him. And the only way to protect him was to remain invisible. To accept being called a janitor. To sign humiliation documents and keep returning to this hospital night after night, because James Morrison had carried her call sign for 3 years, and she would carry his until her last breath. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce was just getting started. Sarah's apartment was dark except for the glow of her laptop screen. 3 in the morning. The kind of hour when secrets reveal themselves if you know where to look. She sat cross-legged on her kitchen floor, encrypted surveillance footage playing on a loop, her handler's secure server scrolling through medication logs like confessions written in medical shorthand. The hospital pharmacy inventory. 3 names. 3 veterans. All admitted within 6 months. All received the same supplement logged as vitamin complex. All ordered by Dr. Pierce himself. Morrison was the first. Admitted 8 weeks ago with traumatic brain injury from an IED blast near Sanjin Valley. The second was Petty Officer Graves, admitted 6 weeks prior for post-deployment spinal reconstruction. The third was Gunnery Sergeant Hayes, arrived 4 weeks back complaining of persistent migraines that hospital neurology couldn't explain. 3 warriors. 3 separate injuries. One common thread, a substance that wasn't on any FDA-approved list that Sarah could find, requisitioned through channels that didn't officially exist, and documented in Pierce's handwriting as though it were aspirin. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't drink it. Her hands moved across the keyboard like they were conducting surgery, precise and practiced, pulling inventory manifests, cross-referencing batch numbers, running them through classified military medical databases her handler had given her access to before she came to Savannah. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution. The supplement had been flagged by the Department of Defense 3 years prior. Experimental. Neurological enhancement trial. Terminated for undisclosed reasons. And yet here it was, in a civilian hospital in coastal Georgia, being administered by a man in a white coat who played doctor the way other men played chess, all strategy, no mercy. She photographed every document with her phone. Screen brightness lower to minimum. The apartment walls seemed to contract around her, the antiseptic smell of her cleaning supplies mixing with something darker, something that tasted like copper on her tongue. This wasn't just institutional negligence anymore. This was deliberate. Someone had ordered those supplements knowing exactly what they were. Someone had wanted to see if 3 Navy combat veterans would experience the same neurological effects. Someone had chosen Savannah, chosen St. Michael's, chosen a hospital where a captain operating undercover might be too busy saving lives to ask questions. The encrypted file transferred at dawn. She watched the progress bar crawl, 10%, 30, 60, 85. Her handler's response came back in 4 minutes. 3 words in the subject line: do not engage. And then, maintain cover. Extraction in 72 hours. The message deleted itself. Her secure phone went dark. 72 hours meant 3 shifts. 3 more nights watching Morrison in room 304, watching Dr. Pierce move through the hospital like a man who had already won, watching the experimental cocktail flow through 4 lines into the bloodstream of men who had bled for their country. But Morrison's next dose was scheduled for tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. Dr. Pierce had personally increased the frequency 2 weeks ago, and Sarah had documented every change, every acceleration, every way the protocol deviated from standard post-injury care. She could request removal from his care team. That was protocol. That was the safe play. That was the play that kept her cover intact and her investigation alive. She showered before her shift. Hot water hammered her shoulders with the same intensity as desert heat, and she stood motionless, letting it scald away the choice she'd already made. The mission came first. Morrison was a casualty of something bigger. Morrison was acceptable loss. It was a decision she'd made before in places that smelled like smoke and diesel and death, and it had carved pieces out of her she never got back, the parts that let her sleep without medication, the parts that let her look people in the eye without measuring their utility first. The flag from Baghdad sat folded on her dresser, a triangle of blue and blood-stained cotton, a weight that never got lighter no matter how many times you picked it up. The supply room smelled like bleach and industrial rubber. Sarah was restocking for kits when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his presence shifting the air pressure like a predator entering a space it already owned. He didn't look angry. That was what made it terrifying. His voice came out smooth as surgical gloves sliding on. I've spoken with the board chairman regarding credential verification. We're conducting a comprehensive audit of all nursing licenses. Your original institutions, Baghdad Medical Training, wasn't it? They've been difficult to reach. He paused, letting the implication settle like sediment. Very difficult. Almost as if they don't exist. Sarah didn't look up from the 4 kits. Each one went into the cabinet with mechanical precision, her hand steady as laser surgical guidance systems. My credentials are in my personnel file. Yes. Curiously vague credentials for someone with such confident bedside manner. He stepped closer, and she could smell the cologne he wore, something expensive that didn't belong in a hospital, something that smelled like arrogance with a price tag. I've also recommended to the board that we restrict your access to the ICU. Patient continuity of care, I told them. You've been stretched too thin on the night shift. We need more senior staff in critical care. He smiled like he was offering her a promotion. You'll finish your assigned patient load on general medicine. Professional consistency. No transfers. No exceptions. It wasn't a request. It was a command disguised as institutional policy, and they both understood the game well enough to know it. Restrict her from the ICU, where Morrison would be transferred if his condition worsened. Restrict her from monitoring him. Keep her close enough to watch but far enough away to help. It was the move of someone who suspected something without knowing what. The move of someone dangerous because he was competent, not just loud. Sarah closed the cabinet. The click of the magnetic latch echoed like a small gunshot. I understand, Doctor. I thought you would. He left like he'd won something. Maybe he had. That evening, Sarah requested to be removed from Morrison's care team. She filled out the form herself in the break room while other nurses ignored her presence like they'd been practicing. The request was denied within an hour. Pierce's signature on the response: patient continuity. Staff professional development. Work within your current assignment. The message was clear: you're staying where I can see you, and you're staying far enough from Morrison that you can't interfere with what comes next. She visited room 304 anyway, 20 minutes before her shift ended. Morrison was awake, watching the window where Savannah's humidity hung like a living thing outside the glass. His physical therapy had been aggressive all week. Pierce had personally increased the intensity, the representatives, the neurological demand, pushing Morrison's recovering brain faster than post-injury protocols recommended, like he was testing something, measuring something, waiting for a specific result that he already knew was coming. Morrison gripped her wrist as she checked his foresight. His hand was stronger than it should have been. His eyes held something that wasn't quite memory but wasn't quite forgetting either. "I know you," he said. "Not from here. From before. Baghdad. You were there. I remember the dust. I remember your voice telling me to breathe. I remember," his hand tightened. "I remember you carrying me." Sarah gently removed his fingers from her wrist. The motion was practiced, efficient, devoid of the kindness he deserved. "You're confused, James. The medication affects short-term memory consolidation. Rest. Let your brain heal." She adjusted his pillows with movements that belonged to a nurse, not to a captain. Not to someone who would move heaven to save him given any other choice. "You'll feel better tomorrow." She didn't stay to see if he believed her. The parking lot was empty when she left St. Michael's. Humidity clung to the pavement like a living thing, and rain threatened from the direction of the Atlantic, the kind of weather that made air feel like water and skin feel like it was dissolving. Sarah sat in her car with a folded flag across her lap, the cotton soft from 72 hours of hands touching it, holding it, letting it remind her who she was supposed to be in this moment. Not a captain. Not a warrior. Not someone who carried wounded men through hostile fire. Just a nurse. Just someone dispensable enough to sacrifice a SEAL to protect an investigation. She calculated the odds. 72 hours. 3 shifts. Morrison's medication schedule aligned with her nights off after tomorrow, which meant Pierce could accelerate the compound's administration without her present to document or intervene. The experimental supplement would progress through his system at maximum dosage for 60 hours straight. She knew what it was designed to do. She'd read the classified trial data. Neurological enhancement followed by catastrophic neural overstimulation. 3 of the enhancement. 7 hours of seizures. Brain death if he didn't receive intervention within a specific window. The rain started then, hammering the windshield like applause or accusation, she couldn't decide which. Her handler's words echoed in the dark, extraction in 72 hours. The mission came first. The mission always came first. That was the code. That was the price of the uniform she wasn't supposed to be wearing. She gripped the flag tighter and didn't feel the fabric cutting into her palms, didn't feel the pain at all, because pain was information and she'd learned long ago not to process that particular frequency. Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, the crash cart's wheels hit the tile with a sound like breaking glass. Sarah was 3 floors away, restocking the medication cart on the 5th floor hallway, when she heard it, the specific percussion of emergency, the thud of a human body meeting linoleum at velocity. Her hands froze mid-motion, a package of sterile gauze suspended between her fingers. No alarm called yet. No code announced over the intercom. Just that single terrible sound that meant something had torn loose from the ordinary world. She moved without deciding to move. Muscle memory from 3 tours in Baghdad takes over the decision-making process entirely. Her body was already running before her conscious mind finished registering the noise. The hallway passed beneath her boots. Room 304 was 3 doors down. She knew the route by the number of floor tiles, 37 steps from the medication station. She counted them without meaning to. 19. 23. 31. The door frame appeared. James Morrison lay on the mat beside the parallel bars, his chest wall seized rigid as concrete, his neck extended backward at an angle that meant his body was fighting for air it couldn't find. The physical therapist stood frozen, hands hovering uselessly above him, mouth opening and closing without sound. Morrison's lips were already moving toward blue. His oxygen saturation monitor showed 96% for seconds ago. Now it read 83. Now 78. The numbers were falling like a stock market in collapse. Tension pneumothorax. His damaged lung, the one compromised by the blast that had cost him his memories, had finally given way. Air was escaping into the pleural space with nowhere to go, and each breath he took was forcing more pressure against his heart. The heart couldn't pump against that kind of force. In 90 seconds, his cardiovascular system would simply stop. "Get crash cart." Sarah's voice came out level, conversational, the way you might order coffee. "Now." The physical therapist didn't move. She was staring at Morrison's face, which had taken on the waxy quality of someone whose oxygen saturation was approaching lethal. The therapist was probably in her first year of clinical practice, probably had never seen a patient decompose this quickly, probably thought she was watching someone die and there was nothing anyone could do. Sarah didn't have the luxury of that paralysis. She was already moving toward the equipment cabinet, already pulling the crash cart by its handle, already rifling through the supplies with hands that had done this in a burning Humvee while rounds punched through the metal walls and the driver was screaming that they weren't getting out. This was cleaner. Quieter. Just a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital hallway. The 14-gauge catheter was exactly where it should be, sealed in its sterile wrapper. She ripped it open with her teeth, faster than fumbling with hands, and located Morrison's second intercostal space, counting ribs with her fingertips like reading Braille. Midclavicular line. She'd memorized the anatomy so thoroughly it existed below the level of thought. 2 inches below the collarbone. The needle slid through skin and muscle and pleura and into the pleural space with the terrible clarity of a perfect strike. The hiss. That was the sound of air escaping, of pressure releasing, of a man's body remembering how to breathe. The ventilator didn't wheeze differently, it had no control over its own output, but Morrison's chest wall softened like a fist unclenching. The saturation monitor climbed. 78. 82. 87. His lips began their transition back from blue toward pink, and Sarah realized her own breathing had synchronized with his numbers, had been holding at the same desperate rate. She didn't remove her hand from the catheter. She secured it with tape from the crash cart, movement smooth and practiced, and only then did she allow herself to notice that 12 people had gathered in the doorway, a nursing staff, residents, 2 orderlies. All of them staring. All of them watching a night shift nurse perform a procedure that required training beyond her paperwork, that required experience she wasn't supposed to have, that required exactly the kind of military medical certification that would erase her cover story in a single breath. Morrison's eyes fluttered open. He focused on Sarah's face for the first time since she'd arrived at St. Michael's as a phantom, a ghost wearing scrubs. Recognition flickered across his features like a light struggling to ignite. Phoenix. His voice was barely a whisper, barely a sound at all. Sarah stepped back. She released the catheter and stepped back because protocol was absolute and she had been compromised and there were still 2 other patients on her investigation roster and the mission parameters did not account for personal connections or the fact that she had once carried this man 3 blocks through streets where every window held a rifle. Stay with him. She was still speaking in that calm voice, the one that sounded like it belonged to someone who had delivered thousands of routine instructions. Monitor the catheter. Contact respiratory if his saturation drops below 90. Keep him on continuous pulse ox. The physical therapist nodded mutely. The gathering crowd was already dispersing, returning to the rhythms of their shifts, to the comfortable fiction that what they'd just witnessed was a simple emergency and not a demonstration of something far more dangerous than anyone's job description allowed. Sarah walked back to the medication cart. She finished restocking the gauze. She documented the needle decompression on Morrison's chart with clinical precision, recording time and vital signs and the exact position of the catheter. Everything official. Everything by the book, even if the book said a night shift nurse had no business performing this procedure at all. Dr. Pierce arrived at 4 minutes past 2. He walked into Morrison's room while Sarah was still making notes in the chart, and she felt the temperature of the hallway drop by several degrees. Pierce's face was composed at first, clinical, professional, the mask he wore around families and hospital administration. But his eyes were different. They were the eyes of a man watching his carefully constructed power structure develop a fatal crack. He reviewed Morrison's chart without speaking. He examined the catheter. He checked the oxygen saturation numbers climbing steadily upward. He listened to Morrison's lungs with a stethoscope, movements mechanical and precise. 20 seconds of clinical silence that felt like 20 minutes. Who performed this procedure? His voice was perfectly modulated, perfectly controlled. A blade made of ice. I did. Sarah kept her own voice at the same neutral frequency. Needle decompression. 14-gauge angiocath. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You are a night shift nurse. Yes, sir. You do not have the credentials for invasive procedures. The patient was in acute distress. Saturation was falling. No other medical personnel were immediately available. Pierce's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough that Sarah could see the muscles working beneath his skin like gears grinding against each other. He said nothing else. He left Morrison's room. He walked down the hallway with his phone already in his hand, and Sarah watched him dial before the elevator doors closed behind him. The call to hospital administration took 40 minutes. The call to the board chairman took 27. The call to Dr. Pierce's mentor at the State Licensing Review Board took 16. Sarah knew the timeline only because she'd learned long ago to recognize the architecture of a professional demolition being built in real time. The pattern was identical to how careers were systematically dismantled in military bureaucracies: documentation, witnesses, institutional allies, a narrative so airtight that the truth became irrelevant. At 2:53 p.m., the charge nurse who had watched Sarah successfully perform the needle decompression received a call reassigning her to orthopedics, effective immediately. By 3:15, Sarah's access to all critical care areas had been revoked in the computer system. By 3:30, a formal notice appeared in her employee file and on the unit board for all staff to review. Nurse Chen performed an invasive procedure beyond her scope of practice, endangering patient safety. Investigation pending. At 4 o'clock, Dr. Pierce walked to the nursing station and requested Sarah's presence. His voice was loud enough that every staff member within 30 feet could hear. Every staff member turned to watch. This was the public component, the element that transformed a termination into a spectacle. Nurse Chen, your employment is terminated, effective immediately. You have endangered a patient's safety through practicing beyond your scope of practice. Security will escort you out. Sarah removed her hospital badge from around her neck. The plastic was still warm from her skin. She looked at the laminated photograph, her face younger, harder, a woman who had already buried friends in Afghani graves and was pretending to be someone else for reasons the hospital would never know. She set the badge on the desk between them. I understand. 2 words. Not a defense. Not an explanation. Just an acknowledgement of the reality that had already been decided before she performed the needle decompression, the moment Pierce realized that her competence transcended what she was supposed to be. She walked to her locker in the break room. The folded flag was still at the bottom, beneath her jacket, and the photograph face down from Baghdad. The flag was folded into the military triangle, the way it had been pressed into her hands at a ceremony she wasn't supposed to remember. The way she'd kept it sealed against her ribs for 3 years, a paper heart beating underneath her borrowed scrubs. Sarah packed the locker slowly. Each object was a piece of a life she was about to abandon again, the temporary identity, the false credentials, the careful performance of being less than she was. She folded her blue scrubs and added them to the hospital laundry bin, returning what she'd borrowed, leaving no trace except the trajectory of a Navy SEAL who now remembered the woman who had carried him through hostile fire and then disappeared into a hallway. Security was waiting. Not aggressively, just present. Sarah walked past them toward the parking lot, and nobody said anything because there was nothing left to say. The rain had started, not the dramatic theatrical rain of stories, just the ordinary humidity of Savannah turning to actual precipitation, the kind of weather that fell on everyone equally regardless of whether they were carrying classified military credentials or simple regrets. But that wasn't the worst part. That was just the moment everything changed direction. the moment when Morrison's surviving memories began connecting to something his damaged brain had buried years ago, when the other 2 patients on her investigation roster were quietly transferred to military hospitals in the middle of the night, when her handler's phone call came through and used the phrase, "cover no longer required," as if a cover was something you could simply discard like a used glove. 2 days later, Friday morning, 54 hours after Dr. Pierce had dismantled her career with institutional precision, Sarah received a phone call from a number that didn't appear on any civilian network. The Pentagon liaison arrived at St. Michael's on Saturday morning before visiting hours, his shoes clicking against the tile with the precision of someone accustomed to moving through classified spaces. He carried a tablet sealed in a black case. Behind him walked a 2-star general whose presence seemed to compress the air itself, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The general's dress blues were immaculate, medals arranged like a history of impossible decisions made under fire. Sarah stood in the hallway outside room 304, still wearing the civilian clothes she'd folded into that morning, jeans, a grey shirt, nothing that announced what she was. Dr. Pierce emerged from the ICU nursing station, his posture still carrying the arrogance of a man who believed institutional power was permanent. The general approached him with a salute that could have cut glass. Behind them, a Marine lieutenant in dress blues appeared holding a citation binder thick as a classified document, because it was. "Dr. Pierce," the liaison said, his voice flat as a surveillance tape. "We need to discuss Captain Sarah Chen's status at this facility." The word captain hung in the air like ordnance. Dr. Pierce's face drained of color. Before he could respond, the liaison unlocked the tablet and turned it toward him. Sarah's personnel file blazed across the screen, Phoenix call sign in capitals, service record spanning 3 continents, medical certifications that made her credentials at St. Michael's look like a cover because they were. Because they had been. The general stepped past Pierce without acknowledging him and approached Sarah's locker, the one where she'd kept the folded flag from her teammate, the only piece of her real life permitted in this civilian world. He opened it. His hand rose to his chest. A full salute, rendered in the silence of a hospital corridor at 08 for 7 hours on a Saturday morning. Not a gesture. A command. Not respect. Recognition. The Marine lieutenant opened the citation binder and his voice filled the hallway with the weight of official record, Captain Sarah Chen, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad, carrying 3 wounded operators including Petty Officer James Morrison through a quarter-mile of hostile fire under intense small arms and mortar fire. For medical intervention under fire. For leadership under conditions of extreme duress. For the highest standards of military excellence and personal valor. Each phrase landed like a defibrillator pad to the chest. Nurses froze at the nursing station. A patient in room 306 pressed his face against the glass. Dr. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. The kind of silence that comes when someone finally understands they have been playing chess against a grandmaster the entire game. Sarah didn't move. Her jaw tightened by maybe 1 millimeter. Her hands, the ones that had absorbed his cruelty with quiet dignity, remained at her sides. The general finished his salute and extended his hand. She took it. His grip held the weight of institutional recognition that no hospital board could ever strip away. By that evening, someone had leaked the security footage. Not Dr. Pierce's tirade from Act 2, that recording had been official hospital documentation all along, but the angle that mattered most. The camera that captured his face as he screamed about night janitors playing nurse. The angle that showed the contempt in his eyes, the venom in his posture, the institutional cruelty of a man drunk on borrowed authority. By midnight, the video had 4 million views. #Night Janitor Nurse trended nationally. News outlets ran it on repeat, each iteration amplifying the cruelty, each share a small death for the man who thought silence meant weakness. The comments section filled with stories from nurses who'd been belittled by physicians, from medical students who'd watched arrogance destroy competence, from veterans who recognized the pattern of someone in power using it as a weapon instead of a tool. A retired Army surgeon from Portland wrote, "This is what happens when we reward ego instead of excellence." A nurse from Chicago posted, "The PTSD we carry from bosses like this one, I felt this in my chest." The algorithm amplified Sarah's composure the moment she wiped that single tear without breaking eye contact, the instant she'd said with voice like a surgical instrument, "I've held dying men with more dignity than you'll ever possess." That sentence went viral separately. 3 million views on its own. It became a ringtone. A profile caption. A tattoo waiting to happen. By Saturday night, Dr. Raymond Castellano released his statement. Castellano, who'd been Pierce's medical school mentor, who'd taught him surgery during the man's formative years as a physician. Castellano, who wore the Navy Cross for his service as a combat surgeon in Quang Tri in 1968, who'd held dying Marines in his own hands and learned what dignity actually meant. His statement was surgical. "I taught Dr. Pierce that medicine is service, not status. I taught him that a patient's life matters more than a physician's ego. That a night nurse with battlefield experience might teach him more than his diplomas ever could. He learned neither lesson. Today I am formally requesting the State Medical Board conduct a full investigation into his conduct and fitness to practice medicine. I am further requesting review of his research protocols, his patient outcomes, and his pattern of conduct towards staff members." What I witnessed in that video was not a lapse in judgment. It was the predictable result of unchecked institutional power meeting someone without the character to wield it responsibly. I am ashamed to claim him as my professional legacy. The statement included 7 specific examples of concerning behavior Castellano had observed during Pierce's residency: patterns of bullying, dismissal of junior staff, resistance to correction, and a fundamental inability to see patients or people as anything other than objects to be managed by his superior intellect. The Florida Times-Union ran it as the lead story. Medical bloggers dissected it frame by frame. Twitter physicians began sharing their own stories of mentors who'd betrayed the profession by treating it as a hierarchy instead of a calling. By Sunday morning, the hospital board met in emergency session. Sarah provided her full mission report in a classified briefing room, including evidence of the unauthorized pharmaceutical trials Dr. Pierce had initiated on vulnerable veteran patients. The 3 other Navy personnel besides Morrison who'd been given the experimental neurological compounds. The absence of informed consent documentation. The pattern of escalating dosages without medical justification. The fact that Pierce had altered Morrison's chart to hide the medication schedule. The investigation took 3 hours. The board announcement took 5 minutes: Dr. Pierce's immediate termination for cause. Investigation into unapproved pharmaceutical testing on veteran populations. Coordination with the FDA and the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General. His medical license suspended pending criminal investigation. His hospital privileges at 14 facilities revoked within 72 hours. His malpractice insurance notified. His career, as it had existed, ended in the time it took to read an official statement aloud. By Monday morning, Dr. Pierce was cleaning out his office on the 3rd floor. Sarah stood in the hallway wearing her Navy uniform for the first time since arriving at St. Michael's, her dress blues immaculate, her captain's bars gleaming like small suns on her shoulders. Her rank insignia caught the fluorescent light and threw it back. He emerged from his office carrying a cardboard box. He saw her. His face moved through 17 different emotional registers in 2 seconds: confusion, rage, dawning comprehension, the specific horror that comes when you realize you have been playing poker against someone with cards you never knew existed. He tried to speak. Words moved around in his mouth like prisoners looking for an exit. She cut him off with one calm sentence delivered in a voice that had ordered men through hostile fire, that had demanded precision under conditions that would have broken most people. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. She walked toward the stairwell. Did not wait for response. Did not allow conversation. The heels of her dress shoes, regulation Navy issue, broken in through 100 ceremonies that had nothing to do with hospitals, made crisp sounds against the tile. He watched her descend the stairwell, this woman he had confused for prey, this decorated warrior he'd mistaken for weakness, and understood with perfect clarity that he had destroyed himself the moment he'd chosen cruelty over competence. 6 months later, Sarah had completed her investigation testimony and returned to active duty at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. She trained the next generation of combat medics, young men and women who would carry wounded operators through hostile terrain, who would learn from someone who'd actually done it. She'd been promoted to commander. James Morrison attended her promotion ceremony, his sister and mother in the front row, his recovery continuing in the way that matters most. He had his dignity back, his memory consolidating around the experience of a woman who'd saved him twice, first in Baghdad and then at St. Michael's when an arrogant physician had tried to kill him with pharmaceutical experiments and institutional neglect. Morrison got a new tattoo that week. A phoenix rising with captain's bars in its talons, placed directly beside the phoenix call sign he'd worn on his forearm for 3 years. The two birds met at their wings like they were dancing. The artist captured the movement perfectly. The tattoo artist, a veteran himself from Camp Lejeune, refused payment. For a SEAL and the captain who saved him, he said, "That one's free." Morrison visited Portsmouth monthly. His conversations with Sarah were easy with shared history, the kind of easy that only comes from having survived the worst together. When young medics asked her how she'd stayed composed through attacks on her character, through public humiliation, through the institutional assault Dr. Pierce had launched, she told them what Baghdad had taught her. That dignity isn't about never feeling pain. It's about choosing how you carry it. It's about the flag you fold with precision, about the tear you wipe without breaking eye contact, about the sentence you speak in a voice like surgical steel. Dr. Pierce drove a medical supply van through Savannah's humid streets now, the kind of August heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. He delivered oxygen tanks to home healthcare patients. Wheelchairs. Compression stockings. The work required no medical license and paid $16 an hour. Sometimes he saw St. Michael's in the distance and remembered the night nurse he'd called a janitor, the woman who'd absorbed his cruelty with quiet dignity and one devastating sentence at a time. He thought about the tear she'd wiped without breaking eye contact. The way she'd folded her scrubs that final afternoon with the same precision she must have used to fold the flag of a fallen teammate. He wondered if she still kept that flag. He wondered what it meant, finally, to have been so thoroughly defeated by someone he'd never actually seen. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. That sentence followed him through every shift. He heard it in the voices of patients who were polite but distant. He saw it in the eyes of fellow delivery drivers who recognized him from the viral video and said nothing at all. Silence, he was learning, was its own kind of judgment. And dignity, once lost, was remarkably difficult to recover. If you found yourself in a position like Sarah's, underestimated, attacked, forced to absorb institutional cruelty while holding the truth close, subscribe to our channel for stories about military justice, institutional accountability, and the quiet warriors who change everything. Like this video. Comment, have you ever been judged by someone who didn't know your true value? And hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story about what happens when classified truth meets public scrutiny.